We'd like to welcome Ike Baker to the Monterey Friends of C.G. Jung. Ike is a practitioner, and I'd like you to speak to what that means after I read your introduction.
Sure.
Or at some point. He's also an independent scholar, historian, author. Here is his book, Formless Fire, which is, it's a good introduction to a whole bunch of different topics, which we'll get into some of those today. He's also host of the ARCANVM Podcast, and I really would point people to that. He's had a whole bunch of really interesting people on that show, including a number of people who were at the conference in Egypt. So ARCANVM features documentary-style presentations and conversations with scholars and practitioners in esoteric traditions. His book, A Formless Fire, Rediscovering the Magical Traditions of the West, examines Western esotericism from antiquity to modern day. He is also co-founder of the Hermopolis Symposium with our friend Mervat Nasser. So, Ike, could you also tell us a little bit about what it means to be a practitioner of these arts?
Sure. I certainly am a practitioner. Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, Lisa, for the introduction. Thanks you for having me. Thanks for being here, everyone. I am a practitioner. In terms of the Western esoteric traditions, right, these are inclusive of things like astrology, alchemy, and ceremonial ritual, particularly ceremonial magic, which, has connotations that are, I would say, pretty diffuse, because it is how misunderstood of an art it actually is. And so I got into ceremonial magic I started really kind of doing my solo practice and investigating sort of what this stuff was about in probably in earnest, probably 2007, 2006. Um, and then
This sounds like a plan.
in 2015, 2016, I initiated into what is called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And so that is a formal lineage of training in primarily Western ceremonial, but also in astrology and in some forms of alchemy. That organization was founded in the 1880s in London by really three Rosicrucian Freemasons. They were part of a Masonic Rosicrucian body called the SRIA, the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia. And it comes down to us in the present day. It's a significant. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was an arc of transmission for a lot of these things into the modern day, including alchemy and astrology, and but more especially ceremonial. So, in that capacity, I practice Western ceremonial. I'm also trained in Qigong and Reiki. I went to school for Chinese medicine. I learned a lot about, meridian theory, Chinese herbalism, this kind of stuff. I spent many years actually working in those systems. So I consider myself a practitioner of Qigong and forms of what we call Taoist inner alchemy. Um, I also practice spagyric alchemy. I studied under really Phoenix Aurelius and Daniel Wiseman. They're two alchemists that are doing great work right now. And of course, astrology is something that I study and practice. I teach it. I use it daily. The I actually There's a type of astrology called electional, and it's basically for the best possible is selecting the best possible moment for something to occur, given many different factors. It's kind of exhaustive, but that I actually I elected for the debut episode of the Arcanum channel, and for the release of the book and things like that. So I use it in that capacity. We can go more into the practice of it, of ceremonial, of alchemy, of astrology. I think maybe after the presentation, just
Mhm.
because I'm going to deliver a lot of very, I think, useful, elucidating, and contextualizing information here. I definitely have a little bit more of an academic tack when I talk about this stuff, at least in presentations. We're going to talk about some definitions of, Hermetic philosophy and the traditions, the lineages that it gets passed down through these sort of religio-philosophical bodies. We're going to be looking at some primary sources, and we're going to talk about how it wasn't really a standalone thing. Hermetic philosophy really grew out of a pre-existing tradition two pre-existing traditions they had this interplay, this back and forth for a long time before Hermetic philosophy proper sort of revealed itself or emerged on the historical record. And it's primarily the Hellenic and Egyptian cultural synthesis that took place over really hundreds of years. But I would say the moment where things like uh, the beginning stages of modern alchemy, the beginning stages of modern astrology, the beginning stages of modern ceremonial magic, and Hermetic texts began to emerge on the historical record around the time of the Alexandrian conquests of Persia and Egypt. So we're looking at about 332 BCE. And we'll get into that. But this is really where we're going to situate ourselves for the time being. So I let me see if I can. Yeah, I can share my screen. We're going to do that. I have some slides for you guys. I always like to include some visuals. And here we go. So the presentation this evening is called "The Life of the Soul: Hermetic Perspectives on the Self." My goal here is to orient you guys towards Hermetic philosophy. Now, there are two separate terms that we use to refer to Hermetic philosophy. There's Hermetism, and that normally, at least in an academic context, that will be applied to the Hermetic philosophy of antiquity. So from about the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE to about the 7th or 8th century CE or AD in the Common Era. The second term is Hermeticism, and that really rises. That comes to the fore more with the Renaissance and the 15th century translations and the reimportation, the rediscovery of this material to the Mediterranean and Western Europe. That is really why we use that designation. Hermetism is sort of if you want to think of it, the root, and then Hermeticism is more the trunk and branches that sort of grow out of the ground and flourish during the Renaissance. But let's get the definition down. So Hermetism is a religio-philosophical tradition which, as I mentioned earlier, evolved out of the Greco-Egyptian cultural synthesis, which was ultimately a product of the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. It has been dubbed Hermetism because of the most common attribution of the literature of this philosophy to the mythical figure of Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes thrice great or thrice wise. This designation is thought to have been explained and arguably the most well-known Hermetic document. Some of you might have heard of the Emerald Tablet. So in the Emerald Tablet, Hermes is said to be the thrice greatest because he, quotes, knows the three parts of the wisdom of the whole universe. Now, for as well known as the Emerald Tablet is, it's actually a relatively late document in the history of Hermetic thought. Um, the only extant historical copy that we have, the oldest version, goes back to about the 8th or 9th century. It's actually in an appendix to an Arabic alchemical text. There are others, namely the 9th century Persian astrologer Abu Mashar, who talks about this threefold appellation deriving from the fact that Hermes Trismegistus was this kind of syncretic figure, right? It was really a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, both of whom were the authors and teachers of the arts and sciences to humankind. Hermetic philosophy really formed in and of itself out of the pre-existing interplay of the Greek and Egyptian cultures. So let me elaborate. A lot of people will use the term Hermetic and Hermetic philosophy synonymously with ancient Egyptian religion. And that's not the case. That's a mistake. We wouldn't need to call it Hermetic philosophy, right? The Egyptians didn't have a god named Hermes. It becomes Hermetic philosophy when the Greeks come. And so there is something very, very important and distinct about that. Now, granted, I mean, I would say that the seed ground for all of this can be found. If you, like anybody that asks me, hey, I want to study Neoplatonism, where should I start? I want to study Hermetic philosophy, where should I start? I mean, for better or for worse, I tell everybody start with the dialogues of Plato, because that is where in the historical record, all of this stuff is amalgamated. This pre-existing, pre-Socratic, and Egyptian natural nature philosophy, it all kind of gets grouped together and put forth by Plato. And miraculously, we have all of his 35 dialogues and most of his letters. So we don't have that from other sources. You know, we don't really have a lot of that level of philosophical discourse and sort of the contextualization of a lot of these beliefs. And so later on, right, there's no Hermetic document that predates the Platonic dialogues. There are none. So much like its sort of cousin, philosophical cousin, Neoplatonism, which was another term for late Platonism, occurring in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries in Alexandria, Egypt, in the sort of same spaces that Hermetic philosophy was flourishing in. They use and they elaborate ideas set forth by Plato. They use both the Hermetic philosophers and the late Platonic philosophers. They are using the same language, which is typically Greek and or Coptic. Coptic is mostly Greek. Most of the letters in Coptic are Greek. It was a way for Greeks and Egyptians to be able to communicate with one another at a time where more people were literate. Initially, it was just the priest class in Egypt, right? They had hieroglyphics. You had to know how to read that. And then it gradually kind of morphed into a more syntactical thing called hieratic, then demotic, and then finally Coptic is where the Greeks come in, and this mostly Greek language is now used in all of these texts. Every single one of them is in either Greek or Coptic. And so they're using the same words with the same specific meanings. So we see a unified vernacular with philosophical and metaphysical concepts. Now, it is attested by some philosophers writing biographically of Plato, Pythagoras, um, Solon, Thales, the greats in Greek culture, early Greek culture. It's attested that they all went to Egypt and they all learned, they were all initiated by a priest class. We just don't have the records of what transpired. So Plato is a really, really great place to start because you will get the ABCs. You'll get the basic vernacular, the basic concepts that become elaborated in Hermetic philosophy and later Platonic philosophy. They are, in my eyes, in my estimation, with all the research that I've done practically and scholastically, um, they are almost twins. They're almost twin systems. So the antique Hermetic tradition, right? We talked about that. Hermetism. The antique Hermetic tradition is contained largely within what is called the Hermetica. And the Hermetica is just a name that we give to the texts attributed to and or involving Hermes Trismegistus, this mythological synthesis of Thoth and Hermes, in the figure of a great philosophical and metaphysical teacher. There are really two, these are sometimes categorized into two different sets. There's the philosophical Hermetica, of which many of you are probably familiar with at least there's a smaller body of philosophical Hermetic texts called the Corpus Hermeticum. But that's only some texts. That's not the whole picture. But they're philosophical and they deal with problems of or discussions of theology, ontology, soteriology. The state of the soul, how it can elevate itself, its relationship to its creator, and its relationship to nature. Then there's the technical Hermetica or the practical Hermetica, and that is essentially those are texts that were made by and for practitioners. So I would say that inclusive or within the later sort of era of Hermetic, the technical Hermetica, if some of you may be familiar with a treatise called the Picatrix, that technically falls within the technical or practical Hermetica. And it's essentially a book on astrological magic, using astrology in many, many ways, but primarily to make talismans and things like that. So there's a practical part and there's a philosophical part, and they have to go together. Now, the Corpus Hermeticum is a smaller portion in what is known as the philosophical Hermetica. Now, in order to really adjust ourselves and wrap our heads around what Hermetic philosophy is, we have to understand what its several core beliefs are or postulates. So, Hermetism is predicated on several beliefs. The first I want to mention is a monad. So this was a branch of the religio-philosophical, really Greco-Egyptian texts and schools, bodies of thought, which believed in something called henotheism. And henotheism is basically like there is a single sort of creative force. You call that God. You can call that, they called it the paternal monad. They called it, nous and all the absolute. And from that comes the myriad of pantheon, really, of the natural forces as anthropomorphized in the in polytheistic deities. It's kind of like if you guys have seen the cover to Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd album, it's like one of my favorite records. It's this tetrahedronal, it's a prism, and white light is passing through the prism, and on the other side, it's refracting the spectrum of color, right? The rainbow. So that's the best possible example that I can use for what they believe the monad was. The monad was the white light, and the gods were the visible color spectrum. But they did believe in an ultimate single source. Quoting from the Hermetica, God is one, his substance is light. The second really, really important thing here is the immortality of the soul, or really the nature of the soul. That is very, very important because it's situating ourselves, right? We have the ultimate, we have the monad, but it's now situating the individual in some sort of relationship to the monad. And so we're going to get more into that. They did believe in a soul, and the word for it was also the Greek word psyche. We know it as psyche. That means soul. They used it in the Platonic tradition, the late Platonic tradition, and this was the word they also used in the Hermetic tradition. Psyche, soul. They believed that mind or intellect, specifically of the monad, of the absolute being, was the creative agency of the creative agent of the cosmos. And that's what's really interesting about that relationship. So they're basically saying, the mechanism by which all things are created, the underlying purpose for their existence is that they have these pre-existing, Plato would have called them forms that are essentially generated and projected from the mind of the monad. The word they used here was nous. Again, that is, you find that uniformly in Platonic and Hermetic traditions. And also all these things, everything I'm saying here too, can also be applied to Gnosticism, which we know Jung was, very interested in. Now, the soul also contains a portion of that nous, of that mind. Like at a very, very attenuated level, right? We don't possess the same portion of nous as the infinite, absolutely not, or even the creative aspect of the infinite. But we do possess nous, and the Hermetists believed that it was in the soul, in the psyche, and it's the fact that we have nous that allows us to essentially ascend and receive or undergo a union with the divine nous. It's the fact that we have it also in us that allows us to be inextricably tied to the divine nous, the divine intellect. And that is going to come into play very largely, and we'll get more into that. I don't want to tarry too much here. Now, they also, the sort of third thing in this equation is the cosmos, which they referred to as nature. They believed the cosmos to have a soul. It was ensouled, and they believed that the individual, the human, was a miniature universe. Again, having attenuated powers, but of like in kind, different in degree, but possessing those things in our inherent makeup, and situated within the broader cosmos. And this is pure Pythagoreanism, and you can find the best example for this in the I would say, the best elaboration of where this comes from in the Timaeus of Plato. Now, again, here they believed in a mystical union, right? The Unio Mystica. They called it the word for this was enosis, so divine union, and that's what I was talking about earlier with the mind of the monad and the mind of the soul. And we're gonna dial down, and well, I know that words like soul, they're a little hazy. They're pretty vague nowadays. We don't really always, two people, three people can say that word and have three different meanings in their heads. So we're gonna clarify what they meant by that. So in the first book of the Corpus Hermeticum, called the Divine Pymander, which means the shepherd of men, I want to quote. Hermes is basically talking with this Poimandres is how it was likely pronounced. Speaking with this, um, almost disembodied intelligence, and he asks him, "Who are you?" And Poimandres responds, "I am Poimandres, the Nous Supreme," right? So that the intellect of the divine. I know what you wish, and I am with you everywhere. Um, so we'll see many of these, or at least several of these kinds of communications, um, typically predicated on this idea of nous. The mind itself being the meeting place of all the different intelligences. They may not manifest to our physical eyes, but there is an access point, a common ground where our intelligence or mind or nous can interact with what we would call noetic life, um, life that is more mental than it is physical. And that brings us to basically okay, you've got this philosophy, you have these things that you believe, you have these metaphysical principles, these ontological principles. What do you do with them? So this is where something called theurgy comes in. Now, theurgy or theoria, this basically means God working. It's probably better defined as divine action. Um, but the sort of poster boy of that era, right? Third and fourth century um, philosophers, metaphysical philosophers, these kinds of guys. The poster boy for that was a philosopher named Iamblichus of Chalcis. And a lot of people will probably be very, very quick to assign him to as a quintessentially Neoplatonic philosopher. And some of that is true. He worked with the philosophy of Plato. He sort of was next in line to be the head guy, the foremost teacher in the school of late Platonism, for sure. But he was much more of a Hermetist in that he sort of chided the Greek philosophers for their over intellectualizing of everything and their kind of hyper rational fixation on things. And he basically said, like, yes, we need to utilize the intellect that we may rise, but at a certain point, the experience that we're striving for is supra rational. It's a transcendental state. Professor Walter Hanegraaff at the University of Amsterdam, he coined a very, very useful term. It's an altered state of knowledge. And it is the experience of which, the phenomenology of which is quite ineffable. And he's saying this is how the Egyptians did it. These techniques, this aim, This is directly from the priest class of Egypt, of Chaldea, which was an archaic name for Babylonia, and Assyria. Right? This is what they were doing. So he really put a tremendous amount of emphasis on this idea that this is what the Egyptians were doing, and so we need to incorporate this kind of work into our our philosophical milieu, which was much more Platonic at the time. And essentially, Iamblichus, a lot of the philosophers that were sort of around him and in his circle and in dialogue with him at the time, they were much more about a kind of mystical contemplation that they called theoria, right? Divine contemplation. And they thought, okay, that's the way that we're going to, sort of ascend back up and have this unio mystica, this henosis with the divine mind. But Iamblichus was insistent that no, there's a priestcraft for a reason. They perform ritual, and therefore these, the sort of path upwards, right? The path of return. I'm trying my hardest not to use too many like Greek jargon words like anagoge, right? This kind of spiritual ascent through the cosmos had to be predicated on some form of material ritual. And that's essentially theurgy. And I could give a whole lecture on this now, but we're going to move forward. So it's basically a system of ritual ascent whose goal is henosis, divine union, based on the principles of the ancient Egyptian priestcraft, at least according to Iamblichus. I want to tell you a little bit. We'll go a little bit further here. There is a cosmology inherent to this. And it's very important to understand the cosmology. Because if you don't understand the cosmology, what we're going to do, what we're very apt to do, especially when there is missing context, is sort of fill in the blanks with our own interpretations of things. And things get very muddy when you start doing that. So it's really important that we get down the first principles of how they conceived of the relationship between the soul and its divine source in the cosmos. So I'm going to quote here again from the Pymander. For the mind being God, male and female, life and light, brought forth by his word another mind or workman, which being God of the fire and the spirit, fashioned and formed 7 other governors, which in their circles contain the sensible world, whose government or disposition is called fate or destiny. So there's a few things here. I've used the term intellect several times. We're not talking about the intellect that you and I, the word as we understand it, contemporarily. It's much more so when they're using it philosophically, they're talking about abstract reasoning. They're talking about, they would say that the intellect, and this is very counterintuitive for modern people, but a lot of the philosophical ideas about the intellect is that it's the highest part of the mind within the soul, because it allows us to see, to put it poetically, the thumbprint of the creator in the hardened mortise of its creation. So this is why they obsessed over things like mathematical realism, geometry, because to them it was a revelation of order, a revelation of mind, a revelation of inherent pattern and relationship. It ultimately led them to metaphysical speculation and belief. Nowadays, if you ask somebody what the intellect does, they probably tell you not that. So we mean very different things when we talk about intellect. So what they would mean is the part of ourselves that is able to grasp what they would call intelligibles, right? Abstract forms, abstract ideas. Sensibles, on the other hand, as we have here, the quote unquote sensible world is the phenomenal world, the world that is grasped by the senses. So that is, I think, is a very important distinction to make. And I also want to point out here, again, I want to reiterate, you've got the monad, right? Containing everything within itself. For the mind, being God, male and female, life and light, brought forth his word, by his word, another mind or workman. So this is also very Platonic, very Pythagorean. This workman, this craftsman, is also called the demiurge. And so this is the aspect, or this is the creative agency that will ultimately fashion the cosmos. But the workman fashions or forms his 7 other governors, which in their circles contain the sensible world, and whose government or disposition is called fate or destiny. So I'm sure that some of you can kind of already see where this is going with that number 7. So to revisit this slide, I've got here what is called the, I guess we could refer to this as the Ptolemaic model of the universe or the cosmos. This was put forth by Plato in his Myth of Ur, Book 10 of the Republic. It was also put forth by one of his students, Eudoxus. So originally, this is the Eudoxian model of the universe, but or cosmos. But the Republic and this model were supposedly, they emerged in the historical record almost contemporaneously. So within 1 or 2 years of each other, these things kind of came to the fore. Now, for I think just over 1,500 years, this was the dominant model of the universe. Some of us will call it geocentric and kind of make it out, this is outdated, this is outmoded. But in reality, when you begin to practice these things, particularly things like astrology, particularly things like magic and alchemy, which utilize astrology, right? They're predicated on astrological timing. You learn that this is not so much a scientific model in the way that we understand science today, but there is something symbolically true about this, right? Because in order for me to subjectively, my subjective position as an operator in anything, whether I'm teaching, whether I'm working, whether I'm, writing, I can only ever view the universe from in here, from where I am in my physical body, in my town, in wherever I am on the earth. So we prefer to call this the georeferential model rather than geocentric, because in order to really work these things and gain insight and be able to understand the insights that the ancient people had, we need to sort of meet them on their own terms and do our best to understand what it is they're trying to say and how they looked at the world, and not sort of reductively and retrospectively paint everybody with this kind of the brush of our own times and turn these things into just complete, obsolete systems. They're not. So if you look at this scheme, right, you've got the 7 visible planets moving outward from the spheres of the elements, right? So this is technically the Earth. If you can see my cursor here, this is the atmosphere, the air, and this is kind of what they would call like the ether or the heat, the fire, the radiance of the Earth. But then you move out and you've got the 7 visible or classical planets: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Okay? So those are the 7 governors. They're also known as the archons, the rulers. Okay, these are the 7 governors that control fate and destiny. This is what astrology is predicated on. Some people will say, well, if you read the theosophical stuff and some of the Golden Dawn stuff, even they're talking about rays and sort of they didn't think of it that way. They just thought of it as these are, the same way I have a physical body. but I have a soul and I have a spiritual hierarchy that transcends me and connects me to something higher, a higher principle, which ultimately governs and animates me. Well, they thought the same thing about the planets. The planets are the physical bodies, but they have spiritual architecture. They have a hierarchy that we cannot visibly see, but we can come to understand through their geometries, through their movements in the sky. And these are the rulers, and they govern fate. Now, this last sphere here that you see all the way on the outside, they called that the inerratic sphere, or the sphere of the fixed stars. So technically, the planets, they were all stars to the ancients. But the planets were planetoi, which means wanderers. So they were wandering stars because they didn't have the same regular movement. You know, if you watch the night sky, if you film it and then play it, fast forward over the course of a couple of weeks, it all moves kind of like in one, swath. But then the planets, they'll go retrograde, they'll station and they'll kind of stand still for a day or two or three. And so they called that the sphere of the fixed stars because they thought, okay, that's the outermost dome of our universe, right? The planets are inside, they're doing their thing. They're kind of like this wheelwork of the cosmos, like a clock. But then the outside, the outermost shell of this nested cosmology, the eighth sphere, right? Otherwise known in Greek as the ogdoad. Ogdo meaning eight in Greek. That eighth sphere was the final sphere of our cosmos. And beyond that is the mind of God, the noetic realm. And so the whole idea of this mystical union and this theurgic trajectory of ascent is based on this cosmology, is getting from here in the center, rising through the planes, through the planets, through the stars, and into the eighth and beyond, into the ninth sphere. And we'll get more into that. So I just want to make sure that that we get that down. Now, they believed in reincarnation, but their word for it was metempsychosis, which means the transmigration of the soul. So at each death, again, we have one of the best and earliest examples of an out-of-body near-death experience in the Myth of Ur, Book 10 of Plato's Republic talks all about this. The soldier named Ur, he dies on the field of battle, and not only does he leave his body, he leaves the cosmos. And he goes into this realm here, the realm beyond the eighth sphere. Okay, so there was this idea, and you can find this in Corpus Hermeticum 13 is probably the best place to find it. There was an idea that the soul, as it reincarnated, entered into the universe this way, coming to the first sphere, passing through the sphere of the stars, passing through a star, really, as it were, and then meeting the first governor, Saturn. Then going down, meeting the second governor, Jupiter. Then going down, Mars. And at each point where they encountered these governors, the soul was traumatized. And that's really the word that is the best translation for that. The soul was it suffered a beating of a certain kind. And you can think of it almost as taking on the particular attributes that correspond to each one of these planets. Okay, so we might say they inherit a vice and a virtue as they move through the planetary spheres, and this is dependent on the position of the planets in the sky, and the signs of the zodiac. Okay, so if let's say Mars is in a really inhospitable place, like Mars is in Cancer, you're going to get a little bit more, you get a very strong vice, perhaps, from Mars, more so than a virtue. You might have to work harder to acquire that virtue. But these are all things that are being they are accretions that are laid on the soul, like garments. and weigh the soul down in its journey, making it heavier and more convoluted, really. And that's what ends up being your persona. So the ways in which you will be um, sort of predisposed to behave, not completely bound, right? Because then there's no chance of theurgy. There's no chance of ascent. But for most people, it's just as good as fate. To try and break out of these habits and patterns requires a lifestyle overhaul. Um, so yeah, and so that kind of divestiture without having to die of these traumas, these vices. We want to hang on to the virtues. Um, the divestiture of these vices is what they believed would allow a levity or buoyancy or passage of the soul onto a higher realm. From the Pymander, right? I'm going to do the full quote, but I just listed the end here. This is from the Pymander talking about that sort of reverse trajectory. Quote, first, in releasing the material body, you give the body itself over to alteration, and the form that you used to have vanishes. To the daimon, you give over your temperament, now inactive. Your body's senses rise up and flow back to their particular sources, becoming separate parts and mingling again with energies. And feeling and longing go on toward irrational nature. Thence the human being rushes up through the cosmic framework. At the first zone, surrendering the energy of increase and decrease. At the second zone, evil machination, a device now inactive. At the third, the illusion of longing, now inactive. At the fourth, the ruler's arrogance, now freed of excess. At the fifth, unholy presumption and daring recklessness. At the sixth, the evil impulses that come from wealth, now inactive. And at the seventh zone, the deceit that lies in ambush. And then, stripped of the effects of the cosmic framework, the human enters the region of the Ogdoad, the nous in the noetic realm. So this is a quote from the Corpus Hermeticum. I'm just going to mention this briefly. So Iamblichus, that we mentioned before, the sort of poster boy, the main promulgator of theurgy, he was a Syrian philosopher, but he worked in the philosophy of Plato. He's most uh, popularly known for writing a treatise that is referred to now as On the Mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians. He wrote this text under a pseudonym, calling himself Ab-Ammon and designating himself as speaking as a priest and for all Egyptian priests. He orients the mystery traditions firmly in Egyptian antiquity, and he exerts knowledge of the metaphysical theory of these priests to form his essentially On the Mysteries was a series of refutations, a sort of um, competing philosopher named Porphyry uh, tried to, he sent him a letter trying to make him look stupid or refute theurgy. And so the letter was rather short, or at least the fragments we have of it. But Iamblichus essentially launches off into a massive diatribe. And luckily for us, because this is our main source book on theurgy. But it's he firmly situates these things in an Egyptian antiquity. So I just wanted to make sure that we talking about that. So Hermetism sort of dwindles and comes to an end. Well, the end of an era at least. It doesn't die out completely, but an end of its Western era with the Sabians of Haran in about the 8th century. Some of this Hermetic fire remained kindled as embers, but mostly lost to the Western Roman Empire, particularly after it fell. The Neoplatonists and the alchemists and the Hermetists mostly moved eastward to either the Perso-Arabic Islamic Empire, where they were greeted as friends and completely flourished, catered to. You had the House of Wisdom built for them in Baghdad, and it flourished in the Middle Ages. We also find them migrating to Eastern Rome, right, which we would call Byzantium. So it's all but lost for the most part to the Christian West in the Middle Ages, and then in the 1400s or 15th century, Cosimo de' Medici, the sort of patriarch of the Medici mercantile and banking dynasty in Florence, he commissions. Well, first of all, what's more impressive is that he acquires all of the Corpus Hermeticum, all of Plato's dialogues, most of the Neoplatonic writings of Iamblichus, Porphyry, Plotinus, all these incredible luminary philosophers, and he commissions their translation out of Greek, Arabic, Coptic, etc., into the lingua franca of their day, which, as we know, was Latin, by a man named Marsilio Ficino. Marsilio Ficino doesn't he really falls in love with the Platonic stuff. Uh, he likes the Hermetic stuff, but he actually didn't even finish translating the full Corpus Hermeticum. Lodovico Lazzarelli was really the translator who fell in love with Hermetism, and he writes his Crater Hermetis, and he is the first person on record to say, "I am a Christian and a Hermeticist." And this really begins this beautiful reconstruction of antique Hermetism, which a byproduct of which is indisputably the Renaissance. But this period really is when we academically would begin to use the term Hermeticism. So, again, talking about the practical Hermetica, these are the things that they were trying to reconstruct and do in the Renaissance, and really successfully uh, began a transmission of systems. Really, I mean, a lot of the stuff that modern practitioners use today comes from Renaissance alchemists, Renaissance astrologers, it's Renaissance philosophers even. So we have astrology, right, which is a major part of the practical Hermetica, the study of the stars and planets as having meaningful effects on human affairs. Alchemy, which we can, sort of reductively say is the transmutation of a substance of lesser integrity and therefore lesser value into one of greater integrity and greater value. And then there's ceremonial, ritual acts which effect an ineffable communication with higher forces. Okay, that's theurgy. Um, and these all play into the ultimate telos or purpose of the religio-philosophical writings, right? Astrology is, as we saw, the cosmology, the mechanism by which this theurgic movement is even possible. It also represents to them the presence of the gods in the phenomenal universe. That's why the planets are named after gods. It is the quote unquote ladder of nature, so to speak, which leads to the pure realms of soul existence and divine thought. Alchemy is predicated on Hermetic philosophy, right? It's been called the Hermetic art. Um, this idea that there even is a pristine state, a monad, or a sort of discrete root of everything, the foundation of everything, the many ultimately coming from a one. That allows us to be able to say, let us refine the substance to its purest state. Because we know we're just taking it from multiplicity or diversity closer and closer towards its ultimate source in unity. That is the refining of a substance, really. And it's done in by different techniques in different systems of alchemy. Um, there's a lot of laboratory alchemists that would like to tell you that spiritual alchemy is new agey. There's a lot of spiritual alchemists who tell you laboratory alchemy is a blind, right? To put people off the real track. It's both. One of the best examples for that is the ancient Egyptian scribe priest Zosimus of Panopolis, who wrote in the third and fourth century about he was an Egyptian scribe priest in charge of metallurgy, and he talked about alchemy. He called it chirokmeta, things made by hand, but essentially he was talking about alchemy, and he said, look, there's inherent patterns in everything. We find them everywhere. And so what's applicable to metal, what's applicable to minerals, is therefore applicable also to the soul, the body, the mind, the spirit. So this idea of transmutation is predicated on Hermetic philosophy. And that Hermetic philosophy says, these are universal patterns. They're in everything. So therefore alchemy can apply to everything. Ceremonial is the method by which the ascent takes place. Mysticism is also present here in important ways. We're ultimately trying to achieve a trans-rational state, as I mentioned earlier, an altered state of knowledge. The word for this was gnosis. I'm going to give an example here now. There is a Hermetic document from the Nag Hammadi codices. It's called the Discourse on the Eighth and the Ninth. And now, referring back to, call to mind our cosmological system of the Ogdoad, that's exactly what we're talking about, or what they are talking about in this discourse, is about they give you essentially they write out an experience of someone's nous, someone's intellect, penetrating the realm of the fixed stars and entering into the eighth and ninth spheres. And this is what gnosis, this is the space in which gnosis was to be had. So he's talking essentially to his son or disciple. He's talking as a kind of a priest here, right? Hermes is talking to Tat. He says, I'll paraphrase and then I'll quote, I'm going to do this thing. You just hang out and listen to me. Try and understand what I'm getting. I'm going to do my thing here. So I'll read from it now. Quote, your part then is to understand. My own is to be able to deliver the discourse from the fountain that flows to me. Lord, grant us truth in the image. Allow us through the spirit to see the form of the image that has no deficiency and receive the reflection of the pleroma. That word means fullness. For already the power which is light is coming. For I see indescribable depths. How shall I tell you, my son? How shall I describe the universe? I am mind, and I see another mind. I see a fountain bubbling with life. I have said, my son, that I am mine. I have seen. Language is not able to reveal this. So this is one of the earliest accounts we have of a Gnostic experience. This priest's, this adepts, this initiate's penetration into the noetic realm, into the realm of divine mind beyond the ostensible or phenomenal cosmos. So I want to define Psyche. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Hermetists, they have defined psyche or psyche as essentially the aggregate aspects of the sum total of the experience of interiority. So that means your thoughts, your emotions, your desires, your dreams, and your nous. All of that stuff that you identify with that happens in here that is unspoken. That's your soul. That's your psyche, right? And the monad is like that. I read from another quote, by his word he made. These words, right? Nous and logos, mind and word, intellect and order. There is this sort of creative capacity there because a word speech, whether written or spoken, reveals the hidden contents of the mind. and or of the soul even. And so in the same way as the monad, the creator creates this way by his word, right? I mean, if you even look at the Brahmanic text, the world comes into being because of the sacred word Om being uttered. You look at the Judeo-Christian Genesis, God says, "Let there be light." He doesn't make a light bulb. So this idea of speech and mind, speech as the revelation of mind, logos or order as the revelation of nous or intellect, is very important in understanding the soul and how we are similar to creative deity. Again, like in kind, different in degree. So that's really important for us to understand what we're talking about when we talk about soul. So they talked also about the soul as well. One thing that I do want to mention is that there was this idea that the soul was somewhat of reflection of the disposition of the what they call the quote unquote interior planets, right? We mentioned that kind of earlier in our cosmological scheme. Um, Soul was thought of as containing mind. So nous was something more divine. It was a brighter spark, a higher thing that ultimately existed within the soul. So the entire trajectory of Henosis was predicated on this idea of, you know, the individual being a universe in miniature, his body and his soul corresponding to the mechanisms or governors of material fate or cosmic sort of phenomenon, but then also possessing an interior nature that was ultimately the capstone of which is nous, which is itself divine, and of which we share in a much smaller capacity. So the whole goal here was a sort of reabsorption of the personal nous into the divine nous. And what's really interesting, I was talking with Professor Hanegraaff about 2 weeks ago, and he said, yeah, nous gets translated a lot as intellect, but what it really means is light. And I thought that that was absolutely fascinating. That it's actually more in reference actually to light. Uh, so there's something really interesting there, this sort of intellectual light. Particularly if you're interested in a lot of these texts, you'll find that interplay constantly. And normally it'll throw people sort of off the trail and confuse people. But when you really dial down and kind of figure out that they're almost interchangeable, the text becomes a lot clearer. So at this moment of reabsorption into the divine mind, um, we have what is called a Gnostic experience. And this transcends words, right? It's like, as Hermes said, how shall I tell you, my son? Language is not able to reveal this. But there's a renovating quality that shines through in the person after this experience. And this is called the Hermetic rebirth, really. And again, I want to say that Gnosticism is somewhat of an extension of this current. But the Hermetic rebirth allowed one to become sort of awake in the dream of life. Jung might call this, he might have considered this almost tantamount to individuation. But it was ultimately a supra-rational, transcendental unio mystica, right? Um, a sort of divine triangulation which reconciles all of our phenomenal opposites here, the polarity that is inherent to existence. Now, so there were consequences to the soul, right? We see this, you almost turn on. Becoming awake in the dream of life for them was like becoming a divine co-creator, a collaborator with the divine mind, an emissary of the divine in the material, with human agency. Um, but if other avenues were pursued, I want to quote here from Plotinus and then compare that to a text from the Corpus Hermeticum, because a lot of what Plotinus said, he was the quote unquote father of Neoplatonism, meaning his philosophy was derived from Platonic philosophy, but it was a much there was enough of an innovative characteristic to it for them to sort of merit the designation that this is now something slightly different. But he talked about the soul. And he said, quote, "The soul is a divine being and dwells in more heavenly places, but has entered body. The soul is a minor god, a derivative aspect of the divine, but compelled by its powers and due to its tendency to bring order to whatever is beneath it, it penetrates to this lower sphere, the material world, in a voluntary plunge. If it turns back quickly, all is well. It will not be injured by acquiring the knowledge of evil and coming to understand sin." Sin here, I think the word that they're using is hamartia, which I think is an archery term. "But the soul may dive too deep into matter and linger too long and get stuck." So that's what Plotinus has to say. Now, contemporaneously, we have the Corpus Hermeticum 10, also known as the Key, which says, "For it is possible, my son, that a man's soul should be made like to God, even while it still is in a body." That's what we're talking about here with theurgy, by the way. "If it doth contemplate the beauty of the good. But if a soul on entering the body of a man persisteth in its vice, it neither tasteth deathlessness nor shareth in the good. But speeding back again, it turns into the path that leads to creeping things. This is the sentence of the vicious soul, and the soul's vice is ignorance. For that the soul who hath no knowledge of the things that are, or knowledge of their nature, or of good, is blinded by the body's passions and tossed about. This wretched soul, not knowing what she is, becomes the slave of bodies of strange form in sorry plight, bearing the body as a load, not as its ruler, but the ruled." And this is straight out of the Corpus Hermeticum. So there are consequences here having to do with if we don't pursue the theurgic path, or let's just say we don't pursue a path of maybe just balance in this lifetime, right? The philosophical word they would have used was sophrosini, temperance, balance, self-control. Uh, if we chose to let ourselves too far off the rail, what was really happening is we were becoming enthralled to the illusions of materiality. Um, and that it conditioned the soul. The soul didn't die and then go on and, as it says, taste deathlessness, but kept reincarnating. You could think of it this way almost. If, I'll speak for myself. If I died tonight, knock on wood, I would have so many, if my consciousness continued on just without a body, it will have been conditioned by so many desires and tastes and appetites and things I like and things I hate and people I'm attached to be able to move on. I mean, that would be a kind of hell. And so, this is what they were saying. The body would rush back down. It would rush into the path that leads to creeping things. What does that mean? It would continue to reincarnate and just stay in this wash dry cycle. So, that's a pretty cursory overview of the main tenets of Hermetic philosophy. I don't. I mean, I'm many things, but I am not brief. I try to be. But I want to give you guys a somewhat of a robust presentation here. Um, Jung, the things that I have to say about Jung are that, I do think that psychology right? You look at the root of that word, psyche, right? Psychology is a massive key. But the fact that we kind of have uh, bifurcated psychology from what I mean, the first time I ever heard this word, it was by reading Jung, separating psychology and from the numinous,
Mhm.
right? The fact that we've put them on two separate areas is a hindrance to being able to gain actual insight about these things, life-changing insight. Uh, um, the psychologization of these tenets, uh, by Jung, also by Silberer, right? Because he really released he published Problems of Mysticism and its Symbolism in 1914, and then after his suicide, Jung kind of took over because there's a lot of alchemy, a lot of the alchemical symbolism in Silberer's work, but the psychologization of it was uh, not totally great because it's psychology is definitely involved, but it's only one part of the scheme. So we don't want to kind of reduce all of this stuff. We want otherwise we're not going to have the Gnostic experience. Now, I don't think from reading the Red Book and from reading some of his letters and things like that, I don't think Jung did that. I think there was a tremendous spiritual impetus to what he was doing that he just kind of got slapped on the wrist for and knew like, okay, I'm not a priest, I'm not a holy man, but I'm a psychoanalyst, and so that's my milieu. I'm going to talk about it in that vernacular. Um, so we're getting late on time here. Just I'll wrap up. I want to quote from my book of Formless Fire. Uh, I include some stuff on Jung and Silberer in the alchemy chapter. Quote, there's evidence which suggests Jung himself had mystical experiences, which he had to disguise from the strict positivistic zeitgeist of the academic institutions from which psychology at this early time was attempting to garner recognition as a science. Jung writes of his composition of one of his earliest works, the Septem Sermonum, right? Seven Sermons to the Dead. He writes, quote, there was an ominous atmosphere all around me. I had the strange feeling that the air was filled with ghostly entities. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, the front door bell began to ring frantically. It was a bright summer day. The two maids were in the kitchen, from which the open square outside the front door could be seen. Everyone immediately looked to see who was there, but there was no one in sight. I was sitting near the doorbell and not only heard it, but saw it moving. We all simply stared at one another. The atmosphere was thick, believe me. Then I knew that something had to happen. The whole house was filled as if there were a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed deep right up to the door, and the air was so thick it was scarcely possible to breathe. As for myself, I was all aquiver with the question, for God's sake, what in the world is this? Then they cried out in chorus, we have come back from Jerusalem where we have found not what we sought. That is the beginning of the Septem Sermones. Then it began to flow out of me, and in the course of 3 evenings the thing was written. As soon as I took up the pen, the whole ghostly assemblage evaporated. The room quieted and the atmosphere cleared. The haunting was over. From that time on, the dead have become ever more distinct for me as the voices of the unanswered, unresolved, and unredeemed. For since the questions and demands which my destiny required me to answer did not come to me from outside, they must have come from the inner world. These conversations with the dead formed a kind of prelude to what I had to communicate to the world about the unconscious, a kind of pattern of order and interpretation of its general contents. So there's the book. You can get it at triaprimapress.com. I go into this stuff in a lot more detail. It's much broader. And then I'm doing a trip for anybody that's interested in this kind of esoteric tourism. I'm leading a 9-day excursion through Upper and Lower Egypt um, with private access to most of the temple sites. Um, and as well as there'll be a 3-night stay as well, that we have 150 acres on King's Island in the middle of the Nile to ourselves. And what we'll be doing is we'll be over these 9 days, we'll be traveling through Egypt to the ancient sanctuaries and holy sites, and I'll be teaching on site the history, theory, and practice of Greco-Egyptian theurgy, which I've discussed at least preliminarily tonight. So for anybody that's interested in that, or finding out more about that, you can reach out to me via my email, which I'm happy to put in the chat, or just go to ikebaker.com, ikebaker.com. On the bottom right of the screen, there'll be this kind of little messenger app. You just click on that, write anything you want. I mean, please be nice, but write anything you want. And that will go directly to my personal mailbox. So I thank you all very much. Maybe we can take a few questions or hear some thoughts, comments, criticisms.
All right, thank you. That was, you put things that were a jumble in my head, like in order, and gave it form and structure, and I really thank you for that.
Yeah. I'd say read all the references.
Yeah, well, just she's got the Lisa's got the book. You just flip to the bibliography and just
No, I have a question though. My question is, how did you get started? What gave you the idea for this quest that you've been on, and how did you go from one path to another to arrive at what you presented tonight? Yeah, in a few minutes.
Yeah, well, so I'm going to tell you a story just because I think most people find it, while a little macabre, it's still probably entertaining. I was about 18 or 19 years old. My aunt, I grew up on Long Island in New York. My aunt had a tenant, and this lady was very nice. She's very quiet, but she ended up actually throwing herself in front of a train. And my aunt went down into the apartment, which had been closed off for over a year, and she found that this lady was a hoarder. And so there were stacks and piles of books everywhere, like in a movie, with like pathways. And so she invited me and my best friend at the time to come over and help her clear stuff out. I saw a book. It just jumped out at me. And I was like, look, this is really what I still have it on my bookshelf. Hold on. Right here. This book right here. It's called The Oracle of Kabbalah by Richard Simon. I walked around my neighborhood reading it for a single day, and I can't say that I was much more educated about Kabbalah by the time I was done with it, but I knew it was important. So I hopped on the white pages or yellow pages on the internet when people used to use that, and I wrote in Long Island Kabbalah Study Group. And a guy's information came up, and I said, "Hey, I want to join this group." And he said, "That doesn't meet anymore, but there's this other thing." And that other thing was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So I kind of stumbled into this by accident almost,
Okay, one thing leads to another. Yes.
Yeah.
When books jump off the shelf, it's not an accident. I've had books jump off shelves at me too.
I've had books jump off the shelf and I put it back and it jumps off again.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, I to be 100% honest with you, I was like disgusted by the thought of writing a book because to me, from my personal viewpoint, like what hubris. There's no way I'm going to be able to articulate anything or contribute anything as well as, the authors that I grew up reading. But again, at a certain point, just when the road, I was offered this stuff. People came at the right time and were like, "Hey, would you want to write a book?" Like, I don't know. What would you want me to write about? And I said, "You could write about anything." So I said, well, here's an opportunity. If I can write about anything, I want to write about everything. And so that's kind of what I did with this book,
Any questions from?
Yes, so Eva.
Eva.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Eva. Unmute yourself.
Well, I was just thrilled because this is kind of like my language but I don't have the historical piece. I work with Kabbalah, if everyone here knows, and I work with Hermetics, and I've been kind of like you. I came in through the back door, like you were saying. I came to it through the mystical Kabbalah, which fell off a shelf.
There you go.
Yes. And so and then I'm also a Jungian psychotherapist. So putting all of these pieces together is just remarkable. And so much of what you said, I mean, we don't even have time. But when you got to the seven governors, the archons, I thought, that's it, of course, because, you can put it on the Kabbalistic tree.
Yes.
And I work with, trying to the intersection between the body and the soul and the spirit through the I don't know, would you call it cosmological? Because planetary systems connected to the chemical, connected to the chakra systems. So I've been but I'm going in through the back door, but all of this is kind of a download. So over time.
Yeah, no, and that's really important. I mean, I didn't start out academic. I started out practice, 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 and I had these experiences for which I had no explanation. And I'll give you an example really quickly, right? So you may be able to relate to this. Dion Fortune is, I consider, a teacher for me from beyond the grave. I visited her in her grave in Glastonbury, and I've read every one of her books. So I the practices that her and Gareth Knight and all the people associated with her, I think you may be familiar with this. So I was doing sort of like these path workings that involved a portion where you do an invocation. You do an invocation in a path working. Essentially, it's just visualization, right? It's kind of sophisticated. It's based on the correspondences of the tree of life. But while a lot of path workings are kind of highly structured, you got to leave. For me, I wanted to leave some space for something to happen where not everything was pre-thought out. And I remember the first time that this happened, a visualization I was having became autonomous. The light, the life in its eyes was existentially startling. And it had such a degree of autonomy that I freaked out a little bit. And the only thing I could say is, I'm not thinking this. I cannot anticipate its movements, its words. It's taken on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And so I had this experience maybe like, I don't know, 50, 60 times. And then I discovered the writing of Iamblichus. And Iamblichus wrote in a treatise called On the Soul, De Anima. He said that when the way that we receive or have these unions, he said this, and I'll paraphrase, but this is pretty close. The mind and attention follow what happens because they're not grasped by the gods. The fantasia, which in Greek means the imaginal, becomes grasped by the god and is inspired and is made more than human, is elevated. And so, having these experiences and then picking up a book, something somebody wrote almost 2,000 years ago, and he's having the same experience. He's explaining my experiences to me. It's like, okay, I got to buckle down and I got to read this stuff because it's only going to continue to inform my practice, and then I can go out and help people do that without having to read 3,000 pages.
I have that little book too.
This one?
Oh yes. Yes.
I've never met anybody who knew it before.
I have that book. Yes, I've had it for years. Yes.
It's great.
Amazing. And some of them, and that's it is a gnosis, isn't it? Because I was teaching a class called every time I've taught any class, Jung or anything with the Kabbalah, the Keter opens up and it's electrical every time. And, and it takes over, as you said. So I was teaching a class called Sophia Sparks, not really knowing, but going through each of this Sephira. as and each of the Sephira and with the astrology and the alchemy, well, the seven elements, right? And as we're going through it, it kept getting more and more powerful for all of us because it does open. It's
Right.
like waiting. The light is waiting. And one other thing I want to say, and then I'll stop because I could go on for Karenyi's book on Hermes. Karenyi, he was Hungarian, and it's my background. And the first in his introduction, he talks about this word. He says "világ" in Hungarian is light and the world. It's the same word. I always thought that's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see it in things like Freemasonry, you see it in things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. There's an intense preoccupation with this idea of light, right? Light and extension, further light, all this kind of stuff. And that's really the substance of the universe and the substance of the creator is light.
Is
And
light.
yeah, and that is what actually there's I could go on a whole tangent with that, but yeah, I don't want to keep you guys up too late. Thank you for your
Thank
contribution.
you. Thank you so much.
Anybody else?
Well, I was thinking about different kinds of mysticism, of ways of getting to the place, just different ways, like you mentioned the Kabbalah and this mystical forms of Christianity and many avenues that can satisfy, in a sense, satisfy oneself. There doesn't have to be, or I think there shouldn't be preset ways of getting to the place. I mean, there's guides that you can formulate and can integrate somewhat, but it seems when you're dealing with mysticism, you are in a lonely place at times, and you have to, just make your own way.
Yes.
Without formulas. I think the formulas can help, but I think they can also distract if they're used too consistently and dogmatically.
Rigidly, yes, yeah. So absolutely. I think that each person is going to need something different. For instance, as a young millennial man who grew up playing in bands, and kind of this itinerant bartender, I needed structure. That structure saved my life, but not everybody's going to need that. And what I learned really is that mysticism is not necessarily the same. It's not synonymous with magic. Magic is more of an active, sort of structured approach, whereas mysticism is contemplative. And as you're saying, it's almost intuitive, and it's almost like improvisational jazz or music in some way that is free form. So yes, but and the thing is, to be able to know how to play music, you had to have studied your scales for a long time too. It only looks easy. But when you reach a level of proficiency, but I do agree with you. I think that not everybody, I think for some people, the theurgic path, not only would it not work, I mean, if you stick with it just because it's like trending or because somebody that you really, really admire told you to do that, and you just beat your head against that wall, it's worse than not helpful. It can actually be harmful if that's not the way that you naturally, can approach these things.
But I think mysticism can be a gift, and but it can be a gift without much verbiage attached to it, and that's what I was reading when I was going over William James, there were so many ways to the mystic experience, or just teach you.
Yes, absolutely. And it's the same as the Gnostic experience. I'd say, theurgy is trying to have the mystical experience, but I would say it exhausts the intellect rather than trying to completely circumvent it. So again, it's two different approaches.
I love this. This is phenomenal. What do you so what do you think is the biggest limitation for people that are practicing magic today? Like what kind of tips or advice or guidance?
Limitation?
Yeah.
The biggest limitation is a positivistic, postmodern, reductive worldview. Having in your literally this factory installed setting. It's like wearing a pair of contact lenses that you never even know you're wearing that color everything you look at a certain shade of gray. And it's based on this assumption that everyone else is wearing the same contacts as I am, and sees everything exactly the same way that I do. I think that postmodernist, positivistic, reductionist worldview it will kill you before you can even start. It will kill the journey, because you'll constantly be wrestling with doubt. And now a certain level of skepticism is healthy, but what they tell us is that, oh well, you can't exist with cognitive dissonance. Well, cognitive dissonance is only there because we're told that it should be a thing, that we should dismiss everything that is not empirical as a priori, it can't happen. Okay, so what I think the magician and the mystic's first real, developmental project is taking my subjective experience and the objective world and holding them side by side without having to reconcile them utterly and completely, right? Because then you're forcing one to play by the rules of the other, but having them side by side in their own domains of authority. I think once you can begin to walk that path of balance, of having, not constantly outsourcing opinion and belief and ideology to quote unquote experts all the time, constantly about everything, but also taking into account your intuition, the evidence of your eyes and ears, but having a balance, right? Using discrimination, using common sense, not favoring one of the horses over the other, but having a harmonious movement of both with you as the sort of charioteer. That's the biggest impediment. And I see it because I'm an administrator in the Golden Dawn and other initiatic systems. I'm a temple chief. I run the Asheville Temple, and I teach people constantly. And what I see coming in is this, really kind of a worldview that's taking these ancient things and trying to shoehorn them into what I believe and what is commonly accepted now. And it's not going to work. You have to meet these texts, meet them at the worldview of the people who wrote them. And so that's what we need to authentically be able to cultivate without abandoning a modern, worldview as well. So straddling both of those things, I would say and also discipline. Again, you don't need that in every system, but you said magic, right? So that's a discipline. People need to exercise discipline. And the only thing that I've seen in the 20 plus years that I've been doing this that will make sure that you stay disciplined is a really strong why. Why am I doing this? If it's not a strong reason for you, you have to be honest with yourself.
Yeah, you mean discipline and consistent effort, right? Not necessarily like limiting your dark stuff, like
Well,
effects or whatever.
discipline would be more like, okay, particularly with magic, there are certain things that you're going to do, right? I have an operation. I have it timed to the thing. I've got my Kabbalistic layout or my Hermetic layout. I've got everything I need to do. But this formula calls for certain type of fasting. I'm a caffeine addict. but I have enough discipline for when I need to be able to pull back and balance these things that I can. Um, and I think that also strengthens your will, which is the power of a soul, you know. I think that that's really important. I'm not talking about repression. Again, I'm talking about balance. I think I mentioned it before, sophrosini, temperance, So yeah, having the light with the dark, but one not overpowering the other necessarily. Finding a way to get them to work in unison, that takes discipline.
Do you think is there some carryover from the Egyptian techniques that is valuable for modern day people doing magic?
Um, I would say it's carried through,
Yeah.
even particularly even into modern magic by way of guys like some of the dudes that I mentioned earlier, the Renaissance magicians, including Agrippa. Um, the vibration of divine names and mantras and epithets and things like that, that kind of auditory component to magic, it's very difficult for modern people because a lot of us live in apartments. And a lot of us, live with we don't have these dedicated temple spaces with beautiful acoustics. But it is super important. And I would also say color. I mean, if you look at, I was in the Valley of the Kings. If you go to the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, because they've been buried underground and sealed for like thousands of years, the pigment on these hieroglyphs is astounding. It's so bright. I can't even believe it's like this. And they incorporated a lot of that into their statuary, right? Zosimus, who I mentioned before, he was a priest scribe in charge of metallurgy. And really, the kind of metallurgy it was the dyeing of metals for the purposes of religious statuary. So he would learn how to dye metals and things like this. And so the incorporation of color, the Golden Dawn developed this into a system of what they call color magic. Um, and it might not be the coolest thing because you're using a lot of primaries, so everything it just looks like you're in a daycare when you go into your oratory. But these primary red and yellow and stuff everywhere, but it's powerful for sure.
Lego colors.
So the what you mentioned earlier about the current worldview, and having to hold the opposites. I think that's a good overlap with Jung, because as you were talking about psyche and cosmos,
Mm.
like soul was it was included both,
Mhm.
like there's the individual soul, and then there is the ensouled world.
Right.
And the ensouled world is kind of what we've lost in the positivistic, uh, materialistic worldview. Um, and Jung was one of the few people who actually said, we live within soul.
Yeah.
I don't know where I'm going with this.
No, I mean, I think it's important to bring it back to Jung. I think most of you probably there know way more about Jung than I do, or at least the real depths of his teaching. Um, but I'd be very interested to see what he had to say along the lines of. I'd like to see more of his private writings on soul. Stuff that he was writing that he didn't have any intention of ever publishing.
Well, if you've read the Red Book, that
Yeah,
was
there's quite a bit, but I'd love to hear, like, I don't know. I just wish there was more. I feel like there's a lot of ellipses in my understanding of Jung, because that period in his life where he had all the visions was very short, and it like gave him years worth of unfolding. Um, but yeah, I mean, the thing about the worldview that I think is really important, and I mean, one of the academics from, Mircea Eliade, his work of the sacred and the profane blew my brain apart. I now had words for experiences that I could not articulate. And one of the things that he points out is that to ancient people, physicality, phenomenality was a symbol, or many symbols, an aggregate symbol of a metaphysical truth, of a metaphysical reality. And so there was no, again, bifurcation of spiritual and material. They were one thing, and materiality there were symbolic truths to it that transcended the physical truths, and I think that is a hard thing for modern people to experience. We talk a lot about the re-enchantment of our worldview. I don't really like that. Why? Because it's predicated, I think, on the suspension of disbelief. And I still think you're wrestling there. I still think you're repressing something, rather than how do you truly cultivate actual belief, actual kind of gnosis. You have to really experience and
Yeah.
see that it's like, oh, this isn't what I thought it was. Like I was hearing all these things about the spirits and the gods, and I had this almost like, I don't know, Disney movie picture in my head because I had no other frame of reference to sort of contrast it against. Then when you allow yourself, really through practice was the key for me. I practiced this stuff, and I had those experiences, and it showed me that, like, oh, I kind of know exactly what's going on here now. It was the preconceptions I had have nothing to do with the reality of the situation. So yeah, and that's the thing, right? Because our body is our persona, the aggregate, the way that you interface and experience me is a symbol of my soul. You can't see my soul, but my soul can give you signs of its nature through my body. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about with this. There's a symbolic truth in materiality.
Yeah. We often talk about Gebser here in this group too, and he was very much interested in the the co-presencing of all of these different ways of I don't want to use the word knowing, that's like of experiencing, grokking the world,
Mhm.
and integrating all of them. We both go through the developmental phases, and when you were talking about the Greeks and how they were developing this ability to abstract at that time, was a very key developmental phase, because they were coming out of Gebser's notion of the mythic worldview, which is the symbolic.
Right.
And so, but now we've gone like to the far end of abstraction. We've lost so much of the symbolic, and at least there's some of us who are working to integrate it, to really become integral and hold all of it, as simultaneously as we possibly can, because it it's all part of us. Gebser says, it's ever present. We sometimes we emphasize I'm getting on a little too long about Gebser. Let me open it back up to other people.
Okay, I unmuted myself because, Jung actually spoke exactly to what you were just saying, Ike, right? Because when they asked him, do you believe in God? Remember, he said, I
No, I
don't
don't.
believe, I know. So I think that ultimately, once we get down into the rabbit hole with Jung, he's always talking about the gnosis. He's always talking about the experience
Mhm.
of knowing. And yes. Yeah.
And you can't say anything about that experience really. But the thing is that there are ways, there are traditions that show you how to approach having that experience. And that's really what something like the Golden Dawn is, or any kind of theurgy. It's just a system that has shown itself to work in attaining this Gnostic experience. And yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky with the knowing versus the belief, and the gnosis and the belief, because there's a chicken or the egg situation, right? Because before the gnosis, you could place the gnosis on top of a mountain, right? Let's do an analogy. Place the gnosis itself, that experience, on the top of a mountain, and the peak of that mountain is hidden in cloud. Well, if you're at the bottom, you don't have that gnosis yet. So you've got to have some sort of investment or belief or faith in order to start that climb. And then once and persist in its various challenges. And then when you finally attain gnosis, yeah, that's when you know. That, and then from then on, that's where but it requires a little bit of hope, maybe is a good word. Hope that
And hope and longing and not knowing, like being really lost,
right.
and I think curiosity is I mean, that's my mantra these days. Just stay curious and stay.
Yeah. Yeah, and they had this idea that the inherent nature of the soul was erotic. And again, not in a contemporary sense. But eros, as in desire, desirous. They say, in particularly the philosophy of Plotinus and Porphyry, the world soul, the cosmic soul that we talked about earlier, it it descended into materiality because the world soul was part of the absolute God, which was unknowable and unutterable because it contained everything within itself. So it was so much of everything that it was nothing. So the soul, being this sort of third phase of the one's activity, sees all of these individuated or individualized discrete things like trees, and Plato would have called them forms. And so seeing them sort of projected or exteriorized, the goal was to reabsorb them, come back to experience unity with the parts of the interior self that have been projected outside. And we see that in human physical love. We see that in love as just a general sentiment of togetherness and unity. But we also see that in the eros that totally conditions psyche. In other words, human beings, I mean, the definition could almost be synonymous with just desirous, human and desirous, desire bound, right? We want a new car, we want a better job, we want to lose a little bit of weight. I need new clothes, I need new socks, I need a new boyfriend, I need a new girlfriend. We need things. I want. We're constantly chasing career, school, coming to listen to me speak, me writing lectures that I want to do this. So the whole Hermetic and Gnostic thing and Neoplatonic thing was the soul is going to want. It's never not going to want because its nature is eros, desire. The challenge is taking it, instead of allowing it to divert itself downward towards materiality constantly, and they're forming like a vortex that pulls you deeper and deeper into those things, to reorient that eros upward towards the source, towards the divine. It's, it's that now I'm not trying to make any, like, hard and fast personal moral statements or what people should or should not be doing. But from the perspective of the Greeks, Hermetists, and the Gnostics, that's precisely what you should be doing is stop orienting your eros outward, right? Because that's a fire that's inexhaustible, right? It's that ages old story of somebody sitting on a mountain of gold and crying. It's because you're not going to find it here. And so to find ways to orient your eros back upward from whence we came.
And I think that's totally, Jung would have totally aligned with that. I think that's in a way the conjunctionis, the third conjunction, which is the unus mundus, in a way, is that what you return, the return.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and it takes lifetimes, I think, and when you pursue this work, I think maybe if you do it effectively, you're able to expedite karma. And what that means is kind of in the same way an alchemist, an alchemist is working with nature. It's an alchemist is just accomplishing in a month what may have taken nature an eon, and so it's kind of a similar concept with spiritual alchemy. I am accomplishing in one lifetime what may have, this karmic sort of restitution or rebalancing that may have taken multiple lifetimes.
And would you say it's working back up through the Ogdoad and releasing the vices, as
I mean, yeah, that's what you should be doing. I mean, I can't say that that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm trying, but it's I would say, yeah, because the hallmark of the monad of the source is fullness, right? We use that word pleroma. That means fullness, totally full. But it's like I said earlier, it's so full, it's empty. It's so full, it's void. It's everything you've ever imagined and can imagine all at once. And we're talking not even physicality. It's a pure mental state. Um, and a vice is something that really is indicative of a lack. And so we're not making ourselves harmonious to the nature of our source, which is total fullness. We're existing and living and perpetuating this illusion that we don't have enough and we're not complete. I'm jealous, I'm envious, I'm gluttonous, things like this. I mean, that's why there's 7 deadly sins, because of the 7 vices of the Greco-Egyptian planets. But also there's 7 virtues that correspond to them. And so that's really what it is getting rid of the things that make you, the traumas of the soul that make you believe that you don't already have it.
Yeah, in the individuation process, Jung would say that you're actually integrating all of that, and the integration is actually the experiencing of the fullness. You've got it all. You're not pushing part of yourself aside.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we do like to be what's the word I want? Observant of our time, and we're a little past 9 o'clock. So if anybody needs to leave, feel free. I want to extend another great thank you to Ike for just This is great. It was a great conversation. You have presented a lot of great information, and we're very appreciative.
Indeed.
And I won't close the room immediately, but if people have to go, we understand.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lisa, so much. It's great to see you again and talk with you again. Thank you, everybody, for having me and for sticking around. And yeah, please do feel free to reach out to me, however you'd like, if you'd like.
Yeah, and check out the trip to Egypt too, because having been there, I can say it. I really wanted to spend more time doing, it sounds like the kind of things that you're going to be doing in those sites. Ceremonies and rituals and
Yeah. Yeah, I've done it a couple of times, but never like this because we'll have the temple spaces to ourselves for several hours. So that's a
yeah.
totally different ball game. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ike.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay.